They were Houston's golden couple, Dr. Trey Dunbar, a brilliant fertility specialist, and his wife, Dr. Michaela Dunbar, a dedicated OBGYN. Together, they brought hope to countless families struggling with infertility, helping others create the children they longed for, but behind closed doors, their own dreams were crumbling. A marriage built on love had turned into a battlefield of secrets, betrayal, and obsession. Then, one night, Michaela was found dead. A tragic suicide, they said. But something wasn't right. The grieving husband, the missing embryos, the woman waiting in the shadows, none of it added up. How does a man go from being a devoted husband and doctor to a cold-blooded killer? And how far will greed and obsession drive someone to commit the ultimate betrayal? Before we unravel this twisted tale, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crime Mysteries for more cases of love, lies, and murder. Dr. Trey Dunbar was the kind of man people admired. At 40 years old, he had built a thriving career as one of Houston's top fertility specialists. Patients traveled from all over to seek his expertise, desperate for the miracle of life. He was charming, brilliant, and precise, a man who understood the science of creation and had the hands of a savior. In the world of reproductive medicine, he was a star. And yet, for all his success, Trey was a man of secrets. He carefully crafted the image of the devoted husband, the perfect doctor, the man who had it all. But behind that polished exterior was something much darker. His wife, 36-year-old Dr. Michaela Dunbar, was just as accomplished, just as admired. An esteemed OBGYN and infertility specialist, she dedicated her life to helping women become mothers, because she knew the struggle all too well. For years, she and Trey had battled infertility, trying everything from hormone treatments to invasive procedures, only to face disappointment after disappointment. But instead of letting it break her, Michaela turned her pain into purpose. She became a voice of hope for women facing the same struggles, a doctor who truly understood her patients' pain because she had lived it herself. Together, Trey and Michaela were seen as Houston's medical power couple, two brilliant minds, deeply in love, working side by side to bring life into the world. They weren't just doctors, they were a beacon of hope. People admired their dedication, their resilience, their fight for the family they so desperately wanted. Their IVF journey wasn't just personal, it was inspiring. Patients and colleagues alike rooted for them, believing that if anyone deserved a miracle, it was the Dunbars. From the outside, their life seemed picture-perfect. They had a stunning home, successful careers, and a love story that appeared unshakable. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. And no one, not their friends, not their patients, not even Michaela herself, could see just how deep those cracks ran. Because behind the loving husband, behind the dedicated doctor, Trey Dunbar was hiding a secret so dark, so unthinkable, that it would shatter the very foundation of the life they had built together. Trey Dunbar had spent his entire career playing by the rules. He was disciplined, meticulous, a man who lived his life in carefully controlled precision. But all of that changed the night he met Jalea Rhodes. It was never supposed to happen. A quick drink after a long shift at the hospital led him to a high-end lounge in downtown Houston, a place where men with money went to escape the weight of their responsibilities. And that's where he saw her. Jalea was magnetic. 27 years old, and possibly beautiful, with a presence that commanded every room she walked into. She wasn't like the women in his world, the accomplished doctors, the professionals who spoke in medical jargon and debated research studies. Jalea was fire, energy, freedom. That night, he told himself it was nothing more than conversation. But the way she looked at him, the way she laughed, the way she leaned in just enough to make him feel like the most important man in the room, it was intoxicating. And Trey, a man who had spent years drowning in the pressure of his career, his marriage, and the weight of his own failures, found himself craving more. What started as a casual affair quickly spiraled into something far deeper. Jalea became his escape. She was everything Michaela wasn't: wild, spontaneous, uninhibited. She didn't talk about fertility treatments or patient consultations. She didn't remind him of the life he had built with Michaela, the one that felt more like a prison with every failed attempt to conceive. With Jalea, there were no reminders of disappointment, no pressure, just passion. And she knew exactly how to keep him hooked. For years, Jalea had built her own empire, transforming from an exotic dancer into a rising influencer. She understood the power of seduction, not just physically but emotionally. She made Trey feel like a man again, not just a doctor, not just a husband drowning in expectations. She made him believe they had a future together. And Trey, in his weakest moments, promised her everything. He swore they would be together, that he would leave Michaela, that they would have a life of their own. A house, a family, a love that wasn't built on struggle and failure. But there was one problem. Jalea couldn't have children. Years of untreated pelvic inflammatory disease (PID) from multiple STIs, which had left her infertile. The damage to her fallopian tubes was irreversible, and every doctor she had seen told her the same thing: natural conception was impossible. If she wanted a baby, she would have to go through IVF with donor eggs or pre-existing embryos. But Jalea refused to carry another woman's child. She wanted her own, with Trey. Nothing else would do. And then she learned about the embryos. Frozen. Waiting. Created from Trey's DNA. The idea consumed her. Those embryos were the answer to everything. They were Trey's children, her future, the family he had promised her. But as long as Michaela was in the picture, they were untouchable. And Jalea wasn't a woman who accepted obstacles. She had spent her entire life taking what she wanted, bending the world to her will. So in her mind, there was only one solution. Michaela had to go. Trey Dunbar had always been a man of control. In the operating room, his hands were steady, his mind sharp, his decisions calculated. But in his personal life, everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. His marriage to Michaela had become suffocating, a reminder of every failure, every disappointment, every dream that had crumbled beneath the weight of their infertility struggles. And then there was Jalea, the woman who made him feel alive, who promised him a new beginning. But Michaela wouldn't let go. Despite the distance between them, despite the cold silence that had replaced their once loving marriage, she refused to give him the one thing he truly wanted: freedom. Divorce was out of the question. She had built a life with him, stood by him, sacrificed for him, and she wasn't going to walk away just because he had grown tired of their vows. And as much as Trey resented her for it, he knew the truth. Michaela wasn't just holding on to their marriage out of love, she was holding on to power. She controlled everything. The finances. The house. The embryos. Those embryos. They were the last piece of Trey's DNA, his chance to have a child, to build the life Jalea wanted. And they were locked away, inaccessible, belonging to Michaela unless she chose to use them. It was the final betrayal. She couldn't give him a child, yet she refused to let him have one without her. It was selfish. It was cruel. And Trey couldn't take it anymore. The answer became clear. Michaela wasn't going to walk away. So she had to disappear. Trey was a doctor. He knew how the body worked, how it failed, how it shut down. If he was going to do this, it had to be perfect. No violence, no mess, nothing that could lead back to him. It had to look natural. It had to look tragic. And most importantly, it had to look like she had done it to herself. Propofol. A powerful anesthetic. Almost undetectable in small amounts. A deep enough dose would cause respiratory failure, slipping her into unconsciousness before she could even realize what was happening. It was quick. Painless. And most importantly, it was something he had easy access to. He spent weeks planning, ensuring there were no gaps in his story. He would prepare her tea, lace it with just enough propofol to send her into a deep sleep. Then, when she was completely unconscious, he would stage the scene, scatter prescription bottles around the bed, enough to make it look like an overdose. He would wait until morning, then call 911 in a panic, the devastated husband who had woken up to find his wife lifeless beside him. And that's exactly what he did. That evening, he handed her the tea, watching as she drank it without suspicion. She was exhausted from work, her defenses low. Within minutes, her eyelids grew heavy, her breathing slowed, and then, nothing. Trey watched as she slipped into unconsciousness, his heart pounding in his chest, waiting. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 10. She wasn't moving. It was done. He carefully arranged the scene, making sure everything looked just right. He placed the pill bottles on the nightstand, knocked one to the floor for effect. He even left a half-empty glass of water by her bedside, the final touch to his carefully crafted lie. Then, he went to bed. He slept soundly. Peacefully. Because for the first time in years he was free. The next morning, Trey called 911. His voice was shaking, laced with grief. He told the dispatcher he had found his wife unresponsive, that she had been struggling, that he had no idea she was in so much pain. By the time paramedics arrived, he was playing the role of the devastated husband flawlessly, tears streaming down his face, hands trembling as he begged them to save her, knowing it was far too late. The medical examiner ruled it a suicide. The stress of infertility. The silent battle with depression. It all made sense. And Trey? He had won. His wife was gone. His secret was safe. And soon those embryos, the future he had planned with Julia, would finally be his. Or so he thought. Trey Dunbar didn't waste time mourning. Less than 2 months after Michaela's death, he and Julia were celebrating their future. Their social media pages painted the perfect picture: romantic getaways, candlelit dinners, and loving captions about new beginnings. But the most shocking revelation came when Julia announced her pregnancy. Twins. Trey's followers flooded the comments with congratulations, marveling at the miracle that had blessed the couple so soon after tragedy. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know the embryos that created those babies had once belonged to Michaela. No one questioned it. But Dr. Ayanna Whitaker did. Michaela's best friend had spent weeks trying to make sense of her sudden death. The official report ruled it a suicide, but Ayanna knew better. She knew Michaela, her fears, her dreams, her unwavering determination. Michaela would have never given up on life, and she sure as hell wouldn't have abandoned the embryos she fought so hard to create. Something wasn't right. The more Ayanna thought about it, the more the pieces refused to fit. Trey hadn't acted like a grieving husband. He had moved on too quickly, erasing Michaela's existence like she was nothing more than a chapter he wanted to forget. And then there was Julia's pregnancy, a pregnancy that shouldn't have been possible. How, in a matter of weeks, was she suddenly expecting twins? Unless... A chill ran down Ayanna's spine. She needed answers. At first, she tried talking to Trey. She played the part of the concerned friend, offering condolences, pretending to believe the lie he had sold to the world. But Trey was careful, dodging her questions, brushing off her concerns with empty reassurances. That only made Ayanna more determined. So she took matters into her own hands. She pushed for an independent autopsy. She started digging, requesting Michaela's medical records, looking for anything, any small inconsistency that could prove what she already suspected. When the toxicology result came back, the findings were damning: high levels of propofol, a drug used in surgical procedures. A drug that should have never been in Michaela's system. The result confirmed Ayanna's suspicions. Michaela had been poisoned with a drug she had no medical history of using, a drug that Trey had direct access to. Ayanna's hands trembled as she read the toxicology report. This wasn't a suicide. This was murder. And now, the man responsible was about to bring 2 children into the world, children who were never meant to be his. Ayanna wasn't going to let him get away with it. She picked up the phone. Investigators reopened the case, and this time, they weren't looking at a grieving widower. They were looking at a murder suspect. It didn't take long for the cracks in Trey's carefully crafted story to start showing. First, they went through his financial records. What they found was shocking. Tens of thousands of dollars had been drained from their joint accounts weeks before Michaela's death. Trey had been moving money, setting himself up for a new life, one without Michaela. Then, there was the hospital surveillance footage. A quiet transaction, tucked away in the late hours of the night. Trey, walking into a medical supply room, using another doctor's credentials to purchase propofol. The same drug that had killed Michaela. It was undeniable proof. He hadn't just planned her death. He had orchestrated it with surgical precision. And then came the text messages. Investigators recovered deleted conversations between Trey and Julia. Conversations where they spoke in code, referring to Michaela as an obstacle in their future. The tone was clear. They weren't waiting for her to move on. They were waiting for her to be gone. But the final nail in the coffin? Julia's own arrogance. She had spent months parading her new life online, luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and of course, the ultimate prize, her pregnancy. But one post changed everything. A simple caption under a maternity shoot. Trey's first children. That single sentence set off a chain reaction. A former colleague of Michaela's saw the post. She knew about the embryos. She knew Michaela would have never given them away. She immediately contacted authorities, and from there, the forensic team took over. It didn't take long for them to uncover the truth. Michaela's consent forms had been forged. The signature didn't match. The dates were wrong. And the notary listed on the documents? Didn't exist. They had stolen her embryos. With overwhelming evidence mounting against them, authorities moved in. At first, Trey held his composure. He was a doctor. A respected man. He knew how to talk his way out of things. But Julia? She wasn't built for this. When the detective sat her down, she cracked. The pressure, the fear, the weight of it all, it was too much. Tears streaming down her face, she confessed everything. Trey had planned it. He had killed Michaela. He had stolen the embryos. And she had been a willing accomplice, desperate to have his children at any cost. Michaela had fought so hard to become a mother. She had died for it. And now, the people who stole her future were about to pay the price. It happened in the middle of the workday. Dr. Trey Dunbar, once one of Houston's most respected fertility specialists, was in the middle of a consultation when the doors burst open. Federal agents swarmed the clinic, their voices cutting through the sterile air. Patients and nurses watched in shock as Trey was handcuffed right there in his pristine white coat. His empire was crumbling. And yet, he showed no emotion. No panic. No remorse. He simply stared ahead, as if this were some kind of inconvenience rather than the moment his life was about to be destroyed. But the evidence against him was undeniable, and the state was ready to make an example out of him. When the trial began, the prosecution held nothing back. They painted Trey as a narcissistic sociopath, a man who had dehumanized his own wife, reducing her to nothing more than a problem to be erased. To him, Michaela wasn't a person. She was an obstacle, standing in the way of his twisted fantasy life with Julia. He didn't just murder her. He stole her dreams, her motherhood, and tried to rewrite her legacy as if she had never mattered. And the embryos? They weren't his children to Trey. They were his property, a means to an end, a way to control the future on his terms. The jury sat in stunned silence as the prosecution played Julia's full confession, her voice trembling as she recounted every detail. The forged documents, the stolen embryos, the cold, calculated murder. And when Julia took the stand, she sealed Trey's fate. She admitted to everything, their affair, her obsession with having his child, the night Trey drugged Michaela and staged her death. She cried as she spoke, claiming she had been manipulated, that she never wanted Michaela dead. But sympathy was in short supply. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before reaching a unanimous verdict. Guilty. On all counts. First-degree murder. Fraud. Unlawful use of human reproductive material. When the judge read the sentence, his voice was cold. Life without parole. He looked Trey in the eye and called him a disgrace to the medical profession, a man who had used his intelligence and skill not to save lives, but to destroy them. Trey sat still, emotionless, as if he refused to accept reality. Julia didn't escape punishment either. For her role in the fraudulent embryo scheme, she was sentenced to 10 years in prison. She wept as the verdict was read, realizing she had thrown away her freedom, her future, and the life she had desperately chased. But the final tragedy of this story? The twins, the very children Julia had schemed and fought for, would never be hers. She gave birth behind bars, and within hours, they were placed in state custody. They would grow up without the parents who had fought so hard to bring them into the world, only to destroy everything in the process. Justice had been served. But at what cost? Michaela had dreamed of being a mother. She had fought for it, sacrificed for it, and in the end she had been killed for it. She should have been the one holding those babies. But instead, she was buried in the ground, her life stolen by the man who once vowed to love her forever. A man who dedicated his life to creating families ended up destroying his own in the most twisted way possible. Trey Dunbar had it all: success, wealth, a brilliant wife who adored him. But it wasn't enough. His obsession with control, his lust for power, and his reckless greed led him down a path of betrayal, fraud, and murder. He thought he could erase Michaela, that he could rewrite history and step into a perfect new life, free of consequences. But in the end, justice prevailed. Michaela didn't die in vain. The truth came out. And Trey Dunbar, once a respected doctor, will never walk free again. But the question remains, what was the most shocking part of this case? Was it the cold-blooded murder? The stolen embryos? Or the fact that a man who helped others become parents saw his own future children as nothing more than a prize to be won? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if this case stunned you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Crime Mysteries for more cases of love, lies, and betrayal.